As you're aware at this time, for 3 weeks now, we've been reading from the sixth chapter of the Gospel of John, which is what we do every 3 years whenever we enter into year B of our set of readings. And the reason for this is because typically we're in the Gospel of Mark through the rest of the year. The Gospel of Mark is only 16 chapters, and so they have to fill in parts of the year with other Gospels. And so they take these 5 weeks and they insert John chapter 6 for this reason. So I want to come back to our gospel a little bit later, but I want to start with our first reading today. Our first reading from the first book of Kings. A lot of times when we get to the first reading, it's pulled out of the context in which this is taking place. I understand what the church is trying to do, helping us to understand that Elijah was provided for by God himself when he sat under the broom tree and really was just expecting to die. But he went to sleep and he woke up and there was a cake and a jug of water for him to drink, and the angel did this 3 different times to give him the strength in order to carry on his journey. But what is the reason that Elijah is in this situation? Elijah has just come from an intense battle. A battle with false prophets and false gods, ultimately. What Elijah is doing is he has just come from, if you remember the story, he has this battle between the false prophets of Baal, whom the Israelites have come to worship because of the Queen Jezebel, and she has brought in all of her gods from her country. And Elijah poses and pits God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob against these false gods. And he says, okay, let's have a competition to see if it's your God that is the God or if it is our God that is the God. The queen of Jezebel, bringing in her false gods, got the entire nation of Israel to follow the false gods. And so ultimately what Elijah is doing is saying, listen, God has taken you out of Israel, out of your slavery. He has placed you in this land. He has set you free. And yet you continue to be unfaithful to me, to him. And so Elijah is proving to the people who the true God is. And so he builds an altar. He says, all right, the false prophets of Baal, you guys build an altar. You do your worship. You do your sacrifice. He said, there's more of you than there is of me, so you go first. And remember the story. They dance around the altar. They cut themselves. They make the sacrifice, and nothing happens. Elijah mocks them in this whole time, and which is kind of an interesting part of the story. He says, maybe your God is asleep. Maybe he's gone outside to relieve himself. Maybe he's gone on a trip. And then Elijah builds his altar, 12 stones under it to represent the 12 tribes of Israel. And he takes buckets and gallons and gallons and gallons of water and pours it over the sacrifice. And he turns to God. He says, you are the one true God. And fire comes down from heaven and consumes not only the sacrifice, but also all of the water and all of the stones and everything that has been placed in that area. And then Elijah puts to death all of the false prophets of Baal. Jezebel, in her anger, wants Elijah dead, and so Elijah is running for his life. The reason I bring up this story and put this story into context is because this story happens in our own lives. We make false gods in our own life. And it's necessary for us to put them to death. To put those false gods to death. The false prophecies that we listen to. Those false prophecies being putting things in the place of God. Listening to political pundits or listening to the media or listening to someone else than God and the church. Those are the false prophets for the false God. Or we listen to someone else and we tend to fall into a certain sin and we continue to live in that sin over and over and over again, and we have a hard time coming out of it. We must put that to death. That becomes our God. And so we must put that to death. And sometimes there's an internal violence that has to take place for that to happen. For instance, if we struggle with gossip, sometimes we can't go back and put ourselves in those situations where we always end up in gossip. Or we have to put ourselves on the line when that gossip comes up and we have to say, this really isn't something that we need to be talking about. This isn't good for us. St. Paul says about gossip, say only the good things people need to hear. Maybe we struggle with some sexual sin. We need to make a change in our life such that we no longer enter into that sin and put ourselves in that place of temptation. We need to do violence internally to cut out that sin and to live in the freedom that God has won for us. But also recognize that when we make that act, and in a sense, we are sometimes sent into exile because we have done this act to make ourselves better, to put ourselves in the place that we want to be in God's realm, because we want to follow God, we find ourselves in exile. And in that exile, we have to remember that we are like Elijah, that God feeds us, that God provides for us. And we see how God provides for us throughout these verses of John chapter 6. Jesus says that he gives us his flesh to eat. He gives us his own body and his own blood in order to sustain us during this time when we might find ourselves in exile. We find ourselves in exile because maybe we have to cut ourselves off from a certain group of people that we find ourselves entering into sin with. And so we find ourselves alone. We find ourselves in a desert. We find ourselves in a wilderness. But God is present, and God continues to feed us. We also can find ourselves like the people of Israel in the gospel today, or we find ourselves like the people of Israel 2 weeks ago, when they find themselves in the wilderness and Moses has just led them out of their slavery, and they're grumbling and murmuring against Moses and against God, and saying, "You have brought us out into the wilderness to die. We have no meat. We have nothing to eat." And then they get tired of the manna that God has rained down from heaven, and they get tired of the quail that God feeds them in the evening, and they complain against him. And they grumble against God. And we see it again in our gospel today. The Jews murmured about Jesus because he said, "I am the bread that came down from heaven." They grumble against Jesus. They kind of talk behind his back. They don't believe him because they said, "Don't we know this guy? Isn't he just the son of Joseph the carpenter? Isn't he just married? Haven't we seen him since he was a little child?" And Jesus says, "No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draw him, and I will raise him on the last day." Do we find ourselves grumbling against God's goodness in our own lives? Do we find ourselves wanting to turn back to the false prophets? Remember 2 weeks ago when it says that the Israelites desire to be in slavery again so that they may live a comfortable life and the food that they liked. The life in Christ is not always comfortable. In fact, it rarely is. The life in Christ is one that pushes us and challenges us to root out the sin that lives in our heart, to root out the false gods that are in our lives, to root out the slavery that we tend to put ourselves into when we go back to that same sin over and over and over again, and we prefer that life of sin over the freedom that God gives to us. But God has come to set us free. He sent his only Son, Jesus Christ, to set us free, To live in his freedom means to allow the grace that we receive from the Eucharist to transform our hearts so that we can live freely in what God desires to give us, so we can respond to that grace and put out that sin that we struggle with. To place ourselves at the feet of the cross, to place ourselves in full submission to God means to root out those sins that keep us from him, means to root out those areas of our hearts that we have not yet given to him. And that can really only happen when we avail ourselves of the sacrament of confession and the sacrament of the Eucharist. And we take that grace from those sacraments and we allow it to work on our hearts. And we put in new behaviors so that that grace can work within us. That grace inspires those works that we do. And those works are because of that grace that we receive. But if we continue to receive the grace and nothing changes, do we really believe that Christ is present and that Christ wants to transform us? Or do we continue to long for the flesh pots of Egypt? Do we continue to grumble against God because this life is difficult? Because the life of grace is hard. And rooting out that sin is very difficult at times. But we always just have to turn back to see what Christ has done for us. And the way in which we do that is to live a life of thanksgiving. Throughout the day, continue to give thanks to God for what he has done for us, for what he has given us. So we may faithfully receive him and live that life of thanksgiving, to live in his freedom, the freedom that he has won for us by his giving of his entire life for us.